Holy One of Israel among you.
Good morning. To those of you who saw fit to roll out of bed and brave the elements, thank you for being here. Hopefully, I guess it'll get colder this afternoon, is what the forecast says, and but at least there's no more snow in our chances. Did you hear the one about the West Texas farmer who got on his knees one night and he prayed, "Lord, I'm begging you, please send us rain." He said, "I'm not asking selfishly for myself, Lord. I've seen rain before, but tomorrow my boy turns 10 years old." The town where I was born in Perryton, Texas, if you look at a map, it's just directly north of Amarillo, about as far north in Texas as you can get without wandering into Oklahoma accidentally. And if you've ever been in that part of the world, you know the land is wide and it's flat as a tabletop. You can lay on your belly and watch a dog run away for 3 days. What you see is what you get. Back when I was an infant, back in the days before Amazon Prime and 2-day deliveries, if my family wanted to do any serious shopping, we didn't drive 2 hours to Amarillo, but we drove 45 miles north to Kansas, all the way across the Oklahoma Panhandle to the town of Liberal, Kansas. Because Liberal had a green stamps redemption center. That might not mean much to you unless you remember what it's like to save up for something slowly until one day you finally have enough to trade it in for something you normally couldn't otherwise afford. It wasn't instant gratification, but when you finally got there to the Green Stamp Redemption Center, you didn't rush because you knew what it had cost to get there. And that's why 40 years later, some of you still have that electric percolator nobody used except for Thanksgiving in 1986 to heat up some cider, taking up room in your cabinet. Or why you've got that aqua blue leather print luggage in the basement with all the photographs and the newspaper clippings and elementary art projects. I don't mention that to wax nostalgic. I think nostalgia has a way of making everything sort of sepia-toned and easier than it actually was. I mention it because where you're from really does shape how you hear certain words. And one of those words for me is joy. See, on the high plains, you learn early that some things are assumed in other places, and you also learn that some things aren't. And when he speaks of joy in the passage that was read for us by Brother Dave, Isaiah is talking as someone who knows the difference. You see, Perryton, I guess the nearest thing to a hometown that I've got, it prides itself on being the buckle of America's wheat belt. Out on the high plains, towns like to choose slogans for themselves. For example, where Natalie and my kids lived and I lived before moving here was the town of Hooker, Oklahoma, a sprawling burg of 1,800 souls and a few stray cats and tumbleweeds. And there, the Chamber of Commerce did exactly what you're already thinking. They just leaned into it and adopted the official motto, Hooker, Oklahoma, a location, not just a vocation. But I digress just a little bit. Because that's actually how towns like that survive. You know, humor. They make a name for themselves because out on the high plains, you learn to brand what you can because so many things in life, like twisters and heat waves, you can't control. And here's the point. Out on the high plains, people know that not everything in life has to be taken seriously. But water is not one of those things. In Beaver County, Oklahoma, for example, they get an average of about 20 to 22 inches of precipitation a year. I mean, that's it. That little rain has to sustain an entire economy that's built on grain production. That in turn supports the beef and hog industries. There's no margin for waste. There's no room for assumption. You notice every cloud. There's a barometer next to the back door of everybody's house. I say that because in a city like this, where nearly everything is federal or adjacent to the federal government or supported by it, in a region that's so verdant and perennially green as Northern Virginia, you might, I don't know, you might hear somebody mention that there's a drought on the radio. Does anybody still listen to the radio? But unless you're like a particularly avid gardener, it's almost entirely non-plausible. Life just goes on. It stays green. The faucets still work, but that's not how drought works everywhere. If you know a little bit about American history, then you know probably about what my great-grandparents and my grandparents and even my parents endured. First came the Depression. And that was something that the whole nation kind of experienced together, that widespread suffering. But then locally, things got worse. The suffering was more localized. People would stuff rags under their doors and still wake up coughing dirt in the Dust Bowl. Crops, they didn't just fail, they got buried under inches of silt. Cattle would starve in fields that looked like moonscapes, if you've seen any of the pictures. And whenever you combine rolling dust clouds with sustained 60 to 80 mile per hour winds, the atmosphere itself just becomes a sort of sandblaster. Paint withers off of buildings. Metal gets scoured shiny. Even your skin gets hit. Your face cracks. Your eyes burn. And you didn't escape it by going indoors because the dust would just come through cracks you didn't know you had. My people were farmers in ground zero of the Dust Bowl, and it lasted for the better part of a decade. I mean, long enough to hollow out families. And then, before the land could forget that, right in time for World War II, a second drought broke out. This one lasted into the end of the 1950s. It was longer lasting, actually, than the Dust Bowl. It just wasn't as apocalyptic in memory. The New Deal agriculture practices had been reformed, and that helped, so there wasn't total economic collapse, but it was relentless. And so that drought that started in the 1940s, it didn't end until the spring of 1957. And when it finally did break, there's not a survivor who can't tell you the day, the month, where they were standing, what they were doing when the rains came, because you remember stuff like that when water is not guaranteed. But the lesson that the plains teach you over and over is that rains aren't predictable. You can't count on water. Then came the 1980s. And this time, it wasn't just one thing, it was everything at once. There was a severe drought that settled over the region that lasted for 6 long years. Water well levels dropped, fields cracked, yields shrank, and year after year. And then layered on top of that environmental strain came a different kind of drought. Paul Volcker's sudden jolt of sky-high interest rates. Maybe that reads like an economic footnote in a textbook, but on the plains, it shuttered family farms that had survived everything else. People drowning on dry ground. See, it wasn't just hard times, it was barely survived times for those few that did. Many didn't. You know, my 42 years of life on earth, I guess I've lived through one regional drought so severe that in the 5th year of it, photographers from the German magazine Der Spiegel came to take pictures of our dry lake bed. There were wildfires 2 years in a row because of the drought. Our city water supply failed completely, and so for 6 months during my 2nd year of preaching, I spent 4 hours a day, 4 days a week, 8 hours a day, volunteering with the other able-bodied men of the community, digging a 10-inch water line through Texas limestone 13 miles long. We had to connect to our neighboring town because our well was out. There wasn't any other option. If we wanted to keep living in the town, we had to have water. Second drought I lived through was the one that finally broke at the tail end of our time living in the Oklahoma Panhandle. It was late one day in April. We got an astonishing amount of rain for out there, 6 inches over 3 days. My daughters, they were 3 and 5 at the time, and they still have these vivid memories of it. the culvert out front running like a river for the first time. And see, when you grow up in a place like that, water isn't just an aesthetic feature, that adds value to your neighborhood. It's not decorative. It's not something that you sip politely at brunch with a lemon and leave a half-full glass on the table when you leave the bistro. No. Water is life. Everything you depend on depends on it. Because if the farmer loses his livelihood, it doesn't stop there. Your grocery store prices rise. The local mortician loses his clientele. School enrollment drops. The barbershop closes. The grocery store goes out of business. And the truth is, when you get right down to the bottom of it, the entire surface economy of the most geographically massive region of this continent depends on water. That's one part of the world that I know pretty intimately. Once, about a year and a half ago, I think it was, Bill Kincaid asked me in a meeting what I thought was the difference about the culture there that made it so religious compared to the Northeast. Now, for some context, in that town where I was, over 10% of the population were members of my congregation. I had the joy of preaching for 3 years to a lot of farmers and ranchers. And I don't know what stereotype you have in your head about a farmer, but let me tell you, they are among the most literate, financially astute, intellectually curious, contemplative, innovation-minded people you'll ever meet. They have to survive. But there was something else I noticed, especially in their prayers. And that's the way that the weather had bred in them a sort of humility, sometimes an urgent despair. You could hear it when they would speak to God, pleading, Lord, send us rain. So when you live there, you know that everything depends on water when it comes right down to it. So the more that I've thought about that question that Bill asked, the more I've come to believe that it has something to do with what the Canadian sociologist Charles Taylor calls a buffered existence. See, in an environment where you're not so buffered from reality, where the sky is big and you work by the sweat of your brow to till the field with the occasional help of John Deere, you know the elements are big and out of your control. And so there's this instinct that we have towards religion that's reinforced, because out there you're under no illusion that your existence is something you can just simply take for granted. A tornado, or pea-sized or softball-sized hail, or a flash flood, or a drought, or even grasshoppers, any of them can come and wipe you out. And when your heart isn't been hardened, whenever you experience actual plagues, that inclines the soul to the fear of the Lord. Maybe that's why God called Abraham, because even in that great city of Ur, his heart was open. See, I'm not claiming any sort of rural virtue or moral superiority. I'm just saying, and I'm not saying really that holiness grows better in dry soil. All I'm really trying to say is that encountering reality directly has this way of inclining the soul towards belief. I've never, like you, I've never lived in a world that's so dry that patriarchs and herdsmen, desert dwellers, spend their lives longing to settle around an oasis. A place where a man can finally stop wandering and maybe set up a stall and go into business and raise his goats and his kids and his wives. And so he digs, and he digs, and he digs. Jacob's well is still in Samaria today. It's nearly 300 feet deep, which means you've got to imagine how deep it was in Jesus' day 2,000 years ago, or deeper still in Jacob's day when he first dug it. You don't dig like that casually or because it's convenient. You dig like that because nothing else will keep you alive. I don't know the joy, that explosion of joy that comes over somebody when they finally reach the bottom of the well. after months, maybe years of digging, back-breaking, bone-wrenching work, and then at last you strike water. You watch it gather cool, clear water, not a trickle, but, well, a promise fulfilled. Those palm trees up top weren't lying when they said there's water here. I don't know that particular joy. Never lived in that part of the world. I've never lived in a part of the world where Bedouin herdsmen would lose their way along with their flock out in the wilderness. 2 days gone now, the animals are leaking, the water skins are empty, and then almost by accident he stumbles on a well. And he's saved. Literally saved. And what he feels in that moment isn't mild relief. It's not emotionally cool. No, it's joy. Unmitigated joy. The same kind of joy I heard in the prayers of those farmers when they would give thanks for every gray cloud on the horizon. See, I've never lived in Isaiah's immediate world, the ancient Near East. I understand it's a geography that's not typically associated with abundance or ease of life. Oh, I know some of you have lived or served in that part of the world. I don't know the experience of being a people forced to march into exile thousands of kilometers through dry and weary land. I don't know what it means to leave your home under threat, just carry what you can, watch the familiar hills of home disappear behind you while the sun beats down and water skins grow lighter by the minute. I don't know what it would have felt like to be those same people returning, to come back home as sojourners, to walk across that same terrain, older now, fewer in number, carrying memories more than baggage, and to arrive not at a palace or strong, well-constructed walls, but at wells. Deep, faithful wells. To hear the sound of water echo up from the darkness. To lower a bucket and to feel its weight full as you pull it back up. I don't know that experience. But that's the world Isaiah is talking about. That's the world that he knows, a world that depends on water and therefore knows the joy of finding it. He says in verse 3, with joy you will draw water from the wells of salvation. Now, normally you're supposed to read a verse like that in context. That's expository preaching, and context matters. It keeps us honest. So here's the context. Isaiah's words here, they're spoken at a moment of real fear in Judah. The Assyrian threats hanging over Jerusalem. Everybody feels doomed. And so Isaiah chapter 12, it's not armchair theology. This is a real-life crisis. The same crisis in which King Hezekiah ordered the digging or the carving out of the Siloam Tunnel, this incredible feat of ancient engineering that's cut through solid rock in order to secure Jerusalem's water supply in anticipation of siege. And so when he speaks of drawing water, his hearers aren't going to first think of poetry and metaphor. They would have thought of deliverance, of survival, salvation. Life preserved when the enemy's at the gates. See, it's this prophetic promise that thanksgiving for God's faithfulness is going to emerge when God's faithfulness to His covenant pledge is fulfilled, and people will respond overflowing in joy. That's the immediate context. But you know, there are some verses in the Bible that you can rip right out of context and they still work. This is one of them. With joy, you will draw water from the wells of salvation. Yeah, it's God's pledge to His people, but it's more than a doctrine, it's an experience. Think for instance, of some time where you experienced some type of salvation. Maybe a police officer lets you off with a warning. I mean, it's never happened to me, but I understand it happens. Or snow cancels school the day of the big test you didn't study for. Or a familiar face appears in the airport when you're far away from home. Or a phone call comes just in time, or a debt's forgiven, or a door that you were just certain was closed is opened, or a long-lost great aunt leaves you $47,000, just enough to get the dentist and your bookie off your back. Now, here's the question. How did that salvation make you feel? I mean, if you had to explain it to a first grader, what would you say? It's in those moments of spontaneous, unearned joy. They're not the thing itself. Actually, they're meant to point beyond themselves. They're directing the heart towards something larger, toward the promise of an ultimate, final, unending salvation that one day we will drink from the river of the water of life. So those small rescues, whether in life or even in an athletic competition, right? Those are foretastes. They're reminders of what it feels like when danger passes and life is given back. Even that vicarious joy that you feel when your favorite or your new favorite player makes a save, that surge you didn't expect, that's a hint. It's a glimpse of the joy that awaits the saints in glory that will have for one another salvation. I'm not talking about like the mild pleasure of smelling a nice bar of soap and saying, well, that was nice. I'm talking about something entirely different. Joy that's endless, boundless. Joy that doesn't diminish by being shared, but simply grows. Isaiah, you see, is saying that God intends something like that for you. Just deeper. That's why centuries later, Jesus, he finds himself sitting beside a well in Samaria. And a woman comes to draw water the way that people always have, bucket down, bucket up, day after day. And Jesus tells her that the water that he gives will become in her a springing well up to eternal life. No longer single draw. Not a ration that comes and goes. Not a relief that brings happiness for the moment but disappears by tomorrow. A spring, an endless source of strength and refreshment and joy. See, water wells run dry, seasons change, even decades of drought can come. Joy thins out, joy can fade, but not this joy. In fact, Jesus himself insists on it. You know, in the Beatitudes, in the very beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus, he keeps using a strange word, makarios in Greek. Blessed. To be congratulated. Now, in the world we would expect that word just to be used to describe the most fortunate, happiest, most enviable states of life. And yet Jesus, he attaches it to people who by every ordinary measure should not be called joyful at all. The poor in spirit. Those who mourn. The meek. Those who hunger and thirst. The persecuted. You see, if you follow that list all the way through the Gospels, the picture that it finally paints is not of a life of ease or abundance, but of Christ himself, rejected, mocked, stripped, nailed to the cross, which tells you something important about the joy that Jesus is talking about. This joy doesn't depend on rainfall. It doesn't depend on the circumstances. It doesn't depend on favorable conditions. Because this joy isn't rooted in what's happening to you, but in what God has done for you. And what God's promised to finish. That's why Isaiah can speak of drawing water with joy even after exile. That's why Jesus can speak of blessedness even on his road to the cross. Because the joy of salvation is not a mood, it's not optimism, it's not denial. It is life that's drawn from a source that cannot, will not, does not fail. With joy, you will draw water from the wells of salvation. And once you've tasted that kind of water, you know the difference. Now to Him who is able to keep you from stumbling and to present you blameless before the presence of His glory with great joy. Amen.